I was watching a recent interview with a 53-year-old man named Nico Clow. He sits there, looking completely ordinary, calmly explaining how a childhood fascination with his grandfather's death slowly spiraled into a sexualized fetish. He describes his time as a hospital handyman, not with shame, but with a chilling nostalgia. He talks about waiting for that specific moment when the autopsy room cleared so he could slice strips of muscle from the corpses and eat them raw. He casually compares the taste to horse meat, insisting it wasn't about flavor, but an uncontrollable impulse. But the part that really made my blood run cold wasn't the gruesome details of the murder he eventually committed or the altar of skulls police found in his apartment. It was what he admitted to doing after he served his time. You would assume that a convicted cannibal, known nationwide as the Vampire of Paris, would be kept as far away from the dead as possible. Instead, he reveals that he forged documents and managed to work in French morgues, completely undetected, for another 13 years after his release. It creates this terrifying paradox. While the public thought he was reformed, he was quietly wandering the corridors of the dead again, even publishing a cannibal cookbook right under the authorities' noses.
And that horrifying paradox, that's exactly what we need to unpack in this deep dive. The fact that this individual could just repeatedly re-enter these environments where his known deviants had direct, unsupervised access. Our mission here is to examine three interconnected failures. First, the psychological trajectory Clow took, from fixation to this extreme paraphilia. Second, the institutional and, frankly, bureaucratic failures that just created this invisible gap for him.
The gap that let him walk right back into a mortuary.
Exactly. And third, the ethical vacuum of the modern digital world that gives violent offenders a public platform today, which is made even more complicated by this history of systemic security failures.
Let's start with that descent, because the source material really highlights just how fragile that psychological development can be in these extreme cases. Clow traces his fixation back to age 10 after his grandfather's death. But the key moment where the switch really flipped was exposure to true crime.
That's right. His path accelerated dramatically just 2 years later. He read about Issei Sagawa, the Japanese student who committed murder and cannibalism in Paris back in 1981. And this wasn't just, reading a news story. For Clow, this combination of the trauma, the grief for his grandfather, and then the immediate sensationalized context of Sagawa's case, it created what he called a sexualized fetish.
It gave him a template.
A template, exactly. It provided a structure for this emerging compulsion he was feeling.
So this obsession with blood and death, it wasn't abstract. It immediately drove his professional life. By 17, he's actively seeking out work that puts him near death.
Which led him right to a hospital handyman job and eventually the morgue.
And this is where that first systemic failure becomes just glaringly obvious. The French system in the early 90s.
Right. He was able to access the mortuary because the hiring standards were, shockingly lax for such a sensitive, unsupervised position.
How lax are we talking? What did you even need to be a morgue worker in France back then?
Well, according to his own testimony, you didn't need formal, specialized qualifications. It was often just a matter of showing, quote, interest and basic medical training.
Just interests.
Just interest. Think about that for a second. In a role that involves handling human remains, often during autopsies, the psychological vetting was essentially non-existent.
So anyone with a dark curiosity could get in.
And someone with a violent and necrophilic obsession was given unsupervised time and opportunity. It's terrifying.
It's like they handed him the keys to the kingdom. This explains how he could start, cutting strips of flesh from corpses, eating them raw, or taking pieces home.
The impulse was uncontrollable, precisely because the system had no controls.
Yeah.
It didn't manage the risk.
Right.
And while he compared the flavor to horse meat, the drive, as he stressed, was never about taste. It was an arousal-driven high. The professional environment became the stage for this escalating impulse.
Which eventually led to murder, Thierry Bissonnier in 1994.
Correct. That was the culmination.
And when police finally arrested him, the extent of his double life was just horrific. We're talking about way more than just a murder weapon.
Oh, yes. The apartment search revealed the full pathology. Bags of blood stolen from a hospital, funeral jars with human ashes, unidentified skeletal remains.
An altar.
An altar constructed of bones and fetuses. And on top of the murder and necrophagia, he confessed to 6 counts of grave robbery. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was a deep, sustained practice.
So he gets convicted, Sentenced to 12 years in 97, but only served 7. And then comes what I find to be the most critical institutional breakdown of all. Despite being one of the most high-risk, publicized offenders in the country, he gets out and goes right back to the morgue. How did he manage that for another 13 years with forged documents?
This just highlights a profound vulnerability in the bureaucratic landscape of the 90s and early 2000s. The process for cross-checking penal records against civil employment, especially for jobs that didn't need extensive professional licensing, was clearly, it was inadequate.
There was no link up?
No. When someone uses forged documents, the system relies on the employer doing their due diligence. But the French healthcare system failed to mandate stringent background checks, or maybe just lacked the tech to rapidly cross-reference someone against a high-risk offender registry.
So because the initial hiring system was so lax, only needing interest, he knew exactly which doors were poorly locked.
He knew the playbook.
And when the penal system released him, the employment vetting system just didn't have the tools to flag a convicted cannibal who wanted access to corpses again.
It's a systemic perfect storm. It proves the procedures for monitoring high-risk offenders after release were fundamentally insufficient. He just bypassed all of it.
It just reveals this urgent need for reform to make sure these vulnerable institutions have vetting processes that are
stringent and coordinated across justice and employment agencies.
That takes us from the bureaucratic failure right into the forensic deep end. To understand the risk Claw poses, we have to understand the psychology of necrophilia. We know the DSM-5 classifies it as recurrent and intense sexual arousal involving corpses, but it's important to remember most people with this classification fantasize. They don't act.
That is a vital distinction. When we look at individuals who actually kill or harm the living and engage in post-mortem sexual acts, what researchers call necrophilic sexual homicide offenders, or NSHOs, we're talking about a far rarer, more dangerous group.
And they have a profile.
A very consistent one. They're overwhelmingly male, often single, and they display histories of sadism and severe personality disorders.
But the research suggests that even within that group, NSHOs aren't all motivated the same way. Can you walk us through the 4 distinct classifications that have emerged from studies of these cases in France and Canada?
This is where the analysis gets really nuanced. These 4 classes are defined by the primary motivation driving the act. The smallest, and maybe the most ideologically pure group, is Class 3, preferential. They're about 16% of cases.
Oh, okay.
These are the only offenders empirically found to specifically kill to obtain a corpse for sexual purposes. They are the true necrophiles seeking that unresisting partner.
So for them, the murder is just a means to an end.
The means to an end. They're typically deep loners, often single, and frequently report underlying sexual dysfunctions. They find power or intimacy only in that complete submission a corpse offers.
That sounds a lot like Claw's early obsession before the murder, that desire for proximity.
It does, but then you have a group like Class 4, sadistic, which is about 25% of cases. For these offenders, the victim's death is fully integrated into the sexual experience itself.
So the violence is the point.
The violence is the point. They are highly organized, use restraints, commit extreme acts before death ante-mortem like sexual assault or genital mutilation. The post-mortem acts are a secondary ultimate means of degradation, and Claw, with his extreme acts and collecting, he shows a strong overlap with this sadistic element.
So it sounds like he straddles the line. He has that preferential need for proximity, but he also engages in these highly organized, sadistic collection behaviors.
That dual classification is exactly why his case is so compelling and so dangerous. Now, the majority of NSHO cases actually fall into the other 2 categories, where the necrophilic act is a secondary behavior, not the primary motive.
Okay, so tell us about those 2 larger groups.
First, you have Class 1, opportunistic. It's the largest group at 33%. Their primary motive for the encounter was often something totally non-sexual, like a burglary. The murder was often instrumental, maybe to avoid getting caught.
And the necrophilia.
It just happened because the opportunity presented itself after the victim was dead. These offenders often used alcohol or drugs beforehand, which suggests impaired judgment let the deviance surface. And finally, Class 2, experimental at 26%. These offenders were mainly motivated to have sex with the living victim. The post-mortem acts were transient, experimental, A momentary curiosity maybe, or an attempt to get further arousal after the victim was dead.
That structural breakdown is essential. It shows us that while some kill for the corpse, many others commit the act just because the system or the situation allowed that secondary gratification. And that connects right back to Claw and the systemic failures we were talking about. He was given a literal opportunity to indulge in necrophagia every day for years.
It reinforces the principle that opportunity is a massive risk multiplier when you're dealing with these paraphilias, and this issue of access and opportunity. It's not confined to the physical world of the morgue anymore. It's now showing up in the digital sphere.
Which brings us to this new 21st century systemic failure. Clow is permanently released, and instead of disappearing, he has leveraged his notoriety. He's found a digital resurrection.
He has become a controversial online personality. He runs a true crime YouTube channel with his partner where they discuss, and critics argue they romanticize, serial killers.
Wearing shirts with Ed Gein or the Zodiac Killer on them.
Exactly. He's published books, including Cannibal Cookbook, and curated exhibitions with macabre memorabilia like Dahmer's glasses.
This just throws up a huge ethical issue for media and content platforms. How does a convicted violent offender who showed no remorse for his deviance or his crime get to profit from and rationalize his history to a global audience?
The public discourse in France quickly focused on this. It's a major ethical quandary. When you provide an unfettered public platform to someone who committed the deepest violation of social trust,
you're not just sensationalizing violence.
You are potentially re-traumatizing victims and their families. It normalizes extreme behavior, allowing him to be treated like some kind of celebrity or expert rather than a reformed criminal.
It creates a sense of proximity for other people who might have similar impulses. It's not just that he's famous, it's that he's accessible.
Exactly. And that risk of proximity is not theoretical. We saw it mirrored online just recently when a self-proclaimed non-practicing necrophile openly asked on a forum if it was ethical for them to pursue a career as a mortician.
And their defense was that they could just compartmentalize, kind of like a doctor dealing with an attraction to a patient.
That comparison is just. It's fundamentally flawed and dangerous in this context. Forensic psychology and historical practice are crystal clear on this. Placing an individual with a powerful documented paraphilia involving the unresisting dead into a position of unsupervised professional power over corpses is a profound systemic failure. You simply cannot rely on self-control in such a high-risk scenario.
And history shows that societies have known this risk for a long, long time. I found it fascinating that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus documented a custom in Egypt. The bodies of high-ranking women were purposefully allowed to decompose for several days before they were embalmed.
And that custom was specifically put in place to prevent sexual abuse by the people handling the corpses.
Wow.
It's an ancient acknowledgement that when you grant unsupervised access to the dead to individuals driven by certain urges, you have to introduce external controls. You need institutional delays to protect the dignity of the deceased and the integrity of the institution.
Which makes the French system's failure to screen Claw, both initially and post-release, even more egregious. They ignored a risk that human societies have been aware of for millennia.
Absolutely. The lesson here is that some risks cannot be managed by trust. They demand stringent, mandatory, and coordinated regulation.
So, synthesizing all this, we've really explored two parallel and critical failures of containment here. First, the lax regulatory environment in the physical world, only requiring interest in basic medical training. That allowed his original acts, his escalation, and his return to the morgues for 13 years.
And second, the utter lack of responsible gatekeeping in the modern digital sphere. It grants an individual whose history represents the deepest violation of social trust and human dignity a massive public platform. It lets him profit from and normalize his history.
So understanding these extreme cases gives us critical insight into why we need stringent vetting in these vulnerable institutions.
And responsible content moderation in the digital realm. They're essential mechanisms of protection for the public and for victims. The profound failure here is the inability of both physical and digital systems to contain or responsibly manage individuals whose documented urges necessitate the most rigorous external controls.